So I was going through some of my old files, 2009, and I was looking at some of these old drawings that I made, and I realized down here, so here we have my very first digital illustration. I specifically remember drawing this like on my very first computer, like the first thing I did when I got my very first computer, and if you look at it, whoa, why does it show two? That's weird. But if you look at it, there's some like little white spots in there and other different mistakes that definitely a beginner would make. So while I redraw it, I'll definitely go over some changes you could make if you're having some of these problems with your own art. So on the left, I have the original piece from 2009, and on the right, you'll see me creating the new version in, what is it, 2018? Oh my goodness, it's been 9 years. Besides having those 9 years of like drawing experience between me and that illustration on the left, I'm also using a different art program. So I'm using Photoshop CS5 on the right, and on the left I remember I used MS Paint, and MS Paint's free. Photoshop is kind of heck of expensive, so there's going to be a quality difference there. I think MS Paint has changed since I've used it, but back when I was using it, you really didn't have a lot of options, and there definitely weren't layers that you could use. So you'll see the one on the left, just the line art quality is very pixelated and rasterized looking, so there's like, you can almost see the individual pixels, whereas the one on the right, everything looks a lot smoother and softer. I can zoom in quite a bit and it still looks pretty smooth. The reason for this is in MS Paint I was working in a much smaller canvas, whereas on the right, well, now Photoshop, I'm using a much larger canvas with a much higher resolution, which allows me to have more pixels squeezed into a smaller amount of space. Kind of, I think that's kind of how it works. So like I always work at 300 DPI, whereas MS Paint I'm sure was 72 DPI, and that's, if you know your math, that's a lot less. So if you're wondering, I always work at 8.5 by 11 usually, and then 300 DPI for my canvas. The other thing that is improving the quality of the one on the right versus the one on the left is the type of brush that I'm using. On the one on the left, this was really the only option besides like the spray paint tool and the paint bucket tool at the time, was the pencil tool. And so when you use that, it had a harsh edge and it was very easy to use the paint bucket tool with that tool. But you get that like very pixelated look, which wasn't really what I was going for. If you're going for something that's more like the one on the right, like I'm doing right now, you want to use the paintbrush tool, which is much softer and cleaner, but it really isn't, it doesn't work well with the paint bucket tool unless you use it the way, well, unless you use the paint bucket tool the way I do, which has to do with using layers. And that's another great thing about almost, I think every drawing program nowadays has layers, and if you're not using those layers, you're really missing out on one of like the biggest benefits of digital art. The best way to explain layers is to show you. So this is the finished layers that I have after completing this illustration. So you'll see, I don't really name them, I'm kind of lazy, but you'll see the sketch layer is separate from like the colors, which are all of these. The shading has its own layer, and then the line art has its own layer. So because of this, basically whatever's on the top, so here I have the line art layer, this line art layer, anything that's underneath of it will not be able to draw on top of it. That makes sense? So basically works like gravity. So if you drop something on top of another thing, it's going to be on top of another thing. So you have the line art, I have all of the colors. Then I have the shading on top of the colors so that it shows over top of the colors. I like to do each of the colors on its own layer, and then I use clipping masks, which are these little arrows, but that's a little bit more difficult to explain. And those are all clipped to this base color, which the base color is the layer that I add the color to everything. So I fill in the entire character with one solid color, and then I create these clipping masks that clip to that base color layer, and I'm not able to draw outside of the base color layer. It's kind of interesting. I definitely would recommend looking into some clipping mask tutorials if you're interested in doing that, but it really does help me, you know, color faster, so I really only have to worry about coloring everything, you know, well, coloring in all the little detail-y spaces once, and then I add the color and do that, you know, I don't know if that makes sense, but it's helpful. And then the sketch layer I can turn on and off. And so each layer is separate. So if you want to turn one off, you just click on the little eyeballs. And I think that works for basically any drawing program. So you can hide layers when you don't want them anymore and things like that. It's very, very, very cool stuff. And I definitely just recommend playing around with it, using it. And yeah, if you're new, it's just the best experience is just the meddling around and clicking random buttons and seeing what happens. Talking more about the art that's actually happening on screen, I decided to add legs because I think last time, 9 years ago, I was very nervous about drawing legs, and I'm pretty sure I tried to draw legs and they just didn't turn out. So I feel like it's only right to just, now that it's possible for me to draw legs, to, you know, take advantage of that occasion and do it. So I've added legs. I don't know what clothes this character should be wearing, so I kind of just made it up as I went. I believe this character was technically supposed to be me. I think it was a self-portrait. Doesn't really look anything like me, but I'm pretty sure that was my intention. So my favorite color at the time was red, but I still managed to throw purple in as the background color, which I find is funny because that's my favorite color now. So yeah, the color red with the hat and the sweatshirt was definitely inspired by the Red Wings and like their jerseys, but you know, toned down a bit to be a little bit more casual. Looking back, what I really like about this old illustration that I've really not done in a while, and I'm noticing this a lot in all of my old drawings, was that I drew curls really, really cute. Like, they're almost, I don't know if maybe some people don't think they're cute, but they're very stylized curls, and like they'll be straight, and then all of a sudden they'll just be like a swoop, and then they'll go straight back down. So I tried to capture that a little bit, but also, you know, throw a little bit more realism at it and make it make sense. So I wanted to capture that idea, but you know, redraw it in my style. Something else I changed going at it to this time around was the colors. You'll see I'm using still a color that you would consider red for the sweatshirt, but it's not the exact same red tone as the one on the left. And that's because I'm trying to, you know, incorporate it all into a cohesive color scheme and colors that all work well together. I'm still new to this, but I was definitely trying my best, and I'm definitely better at it now than I was back then, because I'm pretty sure if I look on the one on the left, I just used random swatches that were available to me. So I grabbed the red color, and I grabbed the peach color, and I grabbed the brown color and the white color, and filled in everything accordingly. Whereas this time around, I use more of a, I have swatches, but I also like to grab the color picker and like the sliders and things, and you know, pick my colors that way, and pick colors that are less saturated or more saturated depending on what I need. So I have a little bit more experience about those sort of things now, but definitely still learning. So I decided to go with the khaki pants because I feel like I always draw jeans. That was the reasoning behind that. And then I also, instead of using like a harsh white color for the elements of the original drawing that were white, I decided to use like an off-white or a yellow, and I think that makes it look a little bit more retro. I really loved the way it looked, and it looks really good with the khaki. And then here I'm adding shading. I feel like I get away without shading a lot because I feel like my attention span just isn't there. I'll draw something, and then by the time I get to the part where I need to shade it, I'm like, I have an idea to draw something else, and I'll start drawing something else. But the original drawing had shading, so it was definitely necessary for me to attempt some shading. I did it differently. I just added a separate layer like I mentioned earlier, and I added all the shading on it in once. So I set that layer to multiply and used like a purple color and lowered the opacity quite a bit, and then just drew it everywhere I needed it, and also used gradients and the selection tool to grab different parts of the drawing and then use the circle radial gradient to create soft, smooth transitions between like the shading and the non-shading. And then I also used the eraser tool to erase bits of the shading, and since it's a separate layer, I can erase the shading without erasing the colors that are underneath, and I can get those like kind of interesting, like it looks like it sticks out a bit more, you know, that sort of thing. Anyway, I also used some of the other tools like levels and color balance tools to kind of adjust some colors in post. So this is it. Oh, I also added freckles because I noticed that there's freckles on that left one. They're very subtle, but they're there, and I've added them to this one. So yeah, here is my finished redraw of my very first digital drawing. I'm pretty sure it is the very first one. I know I did some where I like would draw on paper and then scan it and color it digitally, but this I think is my very first full digital piece. So yeah, it was very nice to revisit it and like just see my own growth over the years. I think it would have been kind of cool. I kind of wish I had drawn it in a more complicated style instead of my jelly bean style, but you know, maybe I'll have to draw this again, but you know, with more anatomically correct features. Maybe. Anyway, thank you guys for watching. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you guys all next week, and I hope you have a delicious evening full of waffles. Bye!